people, animators in Japan, and ask and mention his name, they basically bow down and say the man's a genius. He's the greatest artist to have worked in Japanese animation. And the same thing occurs when you're in Pixar studios in San Francisco, California. In fact, many of those artists have pictures of Miyazaki on their desks, and they don't hesitate to use the word God when they speak of Miyazaki. These are American animators working in Pixar and for Disney. And I should add, if you go over to England and visit Nick Park is the creator of the Great Dog series. I'm forgetting. That's right, Wallace and Gromit. Sorry, I just blanked on that. Nick Park, of course, has visited Miyazaki many times, and he is equally treated as a superhuman creature on that side of the Atlantic Ocean. Miyazaki is important to this story not only as a master of the form, but also as an internationally recognized artist, and the one who is largely responsible, not single-handedly, but largely responsible for pushing Japanese animation away from television series, which is what most of it was up until Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli, his studio, started creating feature films. Miyazaki really believed that the art form, the Japanese animation, was an art form that was meant to be seen on the big screen. In fact, to this day, he says anyway, he's a bit of a curmudgeon, but he says that he wishes there were no DVDs of his films or video cassettes of his films. And he also believes that an audience member should only see his films once and in the cinema, not more than once. That the experience is meant to wash over you just once and in the setting of the cinema, and that's it. That it should be treated as a work of art. And if you note that his production company, Studio Ghibli, which is often erroneously compared to Disney because Miyazaki is considered a master of his form, they produce very little merchandise whatsoever. So unlike Disney, it churns out merchandise before the movie even appears. Miyazaki and Ghibli prefer not to have any merchandise associated with their films. So he's very much a purist. But he was also very important in moving Japanese animation from television series, which Tezuka largely pioneered, into the cinema and into being treated as a major art form, a cinematic art form. Miyazaki, of course, as I said, is still working today. In fact, his latest film, Ponyo, Ponyo on a Cliff by the Sea is, I think, the American translation, is coming out this summer in the United States. So you'll see another Miyazaki film in the cinema this summer. So the metaphor I use in the book, I'm going to put in JPEG form on the screen here, is the Moby Strip, or the Moby Strip, the 19th century mathematical model, which I think is originally German. The Moby Strip expressing, on the one hand, the concept of infinity, or infinite exchange, but also, and it can be made, obviously, with a strip of paper. Some of you may have made this in school, or made this with your students. I did when I was a kid. You cut a strip of paper and reattach it, so that, as you can see, or somewhat see in this model on the board, it's very hard to tell which side is which, or which side is up, which side is down. And I landed upon this metaphor in the book because as soon as I began to conduct my research, interviewing colleagues of Tezuka's, people who'd worked with him, people from his family, the first thing they said to me was he loved Walt Disney. He loved Disney's cartoons and films. And he also loved the work of Max Fleischer, who some of you may know through probably his most famous creation, which was Betty Boop. Fleischer was very playful as a cartoonist. Disney, of course, was in many ways the master of creating that very smooth, cinematic style of animation that is the hallmark of Walt Disney Studios. And so much in love was Tezuka with Walt Disney's work that he claimed to have seen Bambi, the Walt Disney classic, over 80 times. And what he would do is go into the theater, to the cinema, with his sketch pad and copy the images of Bambi. Sit there and copy, frame by frame as much as he could, what he could see on the screen. And then he actually published a book called Walt Disney's Bambi by Osamu Tezuka, which was the Bambi story with his own illustrations, which he then sold on the streets of Tokyo and Osaka. I don't need to mention that the Walt Disney Corporation had no idea that this young Japanese artist was selling these things. The book has since been reprinted in Tezuka's honor, and Disney takes 40% of the sales. So they're getting their own back. But Tezuka was a great fan of these artists, and so the more I began to conduct research, the more American artists or American models of storytelling, of style, and so on would come up in these studios and offices in Japan where they would talk about where these artists got their inspiration. So I started going back and forth really across the ocean. Even Speed Racer, which I mentioned earlier, some of you may know this, but the main character, which in the American version was called Speed, the young man who drove the racing car, he was modeled on the Elvis Presley character from Viva Las Vegas. So if you wonder where Elvis in Viva Las Vegas drives a race car, so if you wonder where that neckerchief came from on Speed Racer, it's from Elvis Presley, the dark hair, the slick back hair, and so on. And the car, which has all these buttons and devices, was inspired by 007, James Bond, and all of the fancy vehicles in the Bond series. So these were Japanese artists who were taking a lot of this Western influence, largely American influence, and tweaking it, obviously, and telling stories that came from their own background and their own sensibility. And so the story, hence the title of the book, of course, JapanAmerica, which is the story of this back and forth exchange, which, if you can picture this Moby Strip spinning, is spinning at hyper speeds now. Because of the internet, because of technology, because of the awareness, where you have American artists immediately picking up on something in a new anime film, Japanese artists, in many respects, getting immediate imagery from the United States, and in fact, caring less and less where these images come from. The actual origin of the imagery is less important than the imagery itself. And the internet, I think, has had a big role to play in that. Again, as I mentioned, if Tezuka was a huge fan of Walt Disney, today's animators in Pixar and Disney bow down before the god of Hayao Miyazaki. So it's really come full circle in that respect in terms of the mutual exchange of imagery. I mentioned a few titles here in section 3 of the outline to illustrate the Mobius Strip. Star Wars, of course, was an enormous film in 1977, which then actually enabled American television producer Sandy Frank at NBC. He produced Name That Tune and Lassie. It was a big deal in the 70s. To purchase Battle of the Planets, or Gatchaman as it was called in Japan. Battle of the Planets was, of course, a story that took place in outer space and involved these battling factions. Gatchaman is now considered a classic Japanese anime and will also be a Hollywood motion picture next year, coming out next year. So you can see what I mean by this revolving Mobius strip of exchange, and going back and forth, influencing and feeding upon the two cultures, popular culture imagery. And as I mentioned, I'm going to just give a quick and very brief intro to some of the visual characteristics, and unfortunately this is not the finest reproduction or way of showing it, but that characterize the Japanese visual form and distinguish it really from the Western approach to illustration. This is an imakemono print. I don't know how well you can see it with the light. Imakemono are the art of scroll painting, which dates back to the 12th century in Japan. And I'm using this print to show you the the approach to landscape. Takashi Murakami, again, the Japanese conceptual